It's the case that's been known as Spygate. The World Motorsport Council then found McLaren guilty of unauthorised possession of Ferrari information.
In 2007, McLaren was fined $100 million for stealing engineering documents from Ferrari. To this day, it's the largest fine in the history of sports. However, that same year, Renault was caught stealing documents from McLaren containing, among other secrets, the diagrams for a device called the J-damper. So what was Renault's fine for stealing? $0 for the same crime. What? According to the FIA, the engineers at Renault had certain fundamental misunderstandings about the operation of the J-damper system. And since Renault's actions based on that misunderstanding had no effect on the F1 championship, they didn't merit any punishment. It's like stealing the teacher's answer key, but then not understanding the key and answering everything wrong anyways. Like, yeah, you cheated, but you cheated so bad, we're not gonna punish you. Once the cat was out of the bag on this mystery suspension device, almost every team in F1 started using it. But after 17 years, the J-damper has been banned for 2022. But what is a J-damper? How does it work? And why is F1 banning it? Today on B2B, we're gonna find out. Let's go.
Big thanks to Keeps for sponsoring this episode. Not too close, Dave. You're gonna burn your marshmallow. Nobody likes burnt marshmallows unless you're a psychopath. Oh, hello there. Ever since I sold my cabin, Dave and me have been on the road to our new home. We're gonna go live at my parents' farm. Okay, you kidding me, Dave? It'd be like a buffet for all the mosquitoes out here. They'd be like, Buzz, Buzz, is that a thigh? And I'd be like, no, it's my head. You wouldn't understand, Dave. Okay, you're not one of the 2 out of 3 guys to experience some form of male pattern baldness by the time you're 35. What I would give to have my hair smell like campfire in the morning. If only I used Keeps. Keeps makes hair loss prevention easy by giving you access to real doctors online. Plus, they'll ship you your hair loss medication directly to your door every 3 months. So don't wait for your follicles to snuff out. Just head on over to keeps.com/B2B or click the link in the description to receive 50% off your first order. Oh, Dave, no, put it on quick, no! No big deal. It's just everything we've ever owned. Why do I like birds?
Before we get into the J-damper, let's cover the basics of a traditional suspension setup. First, you got your springs. The springs absorb energy from a bump, pothole, or possum in the road and then release that energy so it can return back to center. That's why your car returns back to its normal ride height after it hits a bump. The problem with springs on their own is that they oscillate. Once a force is applied to the spring, it'll continue bouncing up and down. We can show you that using a graph like this. The oscillations will eventually slow down and get back to zero, but it takes a long time to settle. You don't want to hit a bump and then keep bouncing around in your car for the next 30 seconds. So we need to dampen those oscillations. One way is by dissipating the energy causing the oscillations. The obvious example of this type of damper is a shock absorber. A typical shock absorber consists of a fluid-filled chamber and a valved piston that pushes through that fluid. The shock and spring are linked, so when the spring compresses, so does the shock. With every expansion and compression of the shock absorber, that piston pushing through the fluid converts some of that system's kinetic energy into heat energy. So instead of spending time bouncing up and down on oscillating springs, the shock absorbers ensure that your car gets back to its steady state quickly. But dissipating energy isn't the only way that a damper can reduce an oscillation. What if, instead of just trying to dissipate the energy, we actually use that energy against the spring's oscillation? That is where the J-damper comes in. J-damper is just the code name McLaren used to keep the device secret. It's technically referred to as an inerter. It's really hard to not accidentally say inverter, but that's what the inventor named it, so that's what I'll call it. When you invent cool things, you get to name it whatever you want. An inerter can take a few different forms, but in this case, it consists of a threaded rod and a flywheel. As a force is applied to one end, the rod pushes up through the flywheel, causing it to spin. This converts the linear energy into rotational energy. Once the force is no longer applied, the momentum of the flywheel is returned back into the rod, making it want to continue in that same direction that the force was applied. If we apply force in the opposite direction, the same thing happens with the flywheel spinning the other way. It's similar to those toy cars with the flywheels. You turn that linear energy into rotational energy, and then you use all that stored up energy to keep the car moving on its own. So, when a force is applied to a spring, it momentarily stores that energy, then releases it back in the opposite direction of the initial force. When a force is applied to a shock absorber, it removes that energy from the system by converting it into heat. And when a force is applied to an inerter or a J-damper, it momentarily stores that energy in the flywheel, then releases it back into the threaded shaft in the same direction as the initial force. The important thing to notice here is that the spring and the inerter both store and release energy, but they release energy in opposite directions. So if we incorporate an inerter into the system and it's properly tuned to the spring and expected forces, we can use this opposing energy to dampen the spring further. Another way to picture this is by looking back at those oscillation graphs from before. Any wave can be diminished by producing destructive interference, which is making another wave that conflicts with the original wave. An interfering wave is one which ideally has a similar amplitude, but which is out of phase, meaning it crosses the center line at a different time or moving in the opposite direction. If we plot the force of the inerter acting on the spring, we end up with a wave like this. Some dampening does occur due to the initial startup of getting that flywheel spinning, but the big dampening comes in with what happens next, with the interference produced when the spring rebounds. For the spring to extend, it has to overcome the stored energy in the spinning flywheel to slow it down and reverse its direction. In other words, the spring has to fight the flywheel's rotational inertia, hence the name inerter. Because the flywheel is resisting the spring's extension, the rotational energy in the flywheel is out of phase with the energy in the spring. So as the spring extends and compresses repeatedly, that oscillation continues feeding energy into the flywheel and in turn feeds that energy back out of phase, interfering with and dampening the oscillations of that spring. This out of phase wave ends up canceling out the wave from the spring's natural frequency. This may well be the most complicated B2B we've ever made. So, are inerters better dampers than shock absorbers? In theory, yes. Instead of simply dissipating the energy from oscillation, an inerter turns that energy back onto itself and should be able to fully eliminate oscillations more quickly than an energy dissipating damper like a shock. That sounds great, right? Well, yeah, but there are also a couple of problems. One, when you want to get rid of those high amplitude oscillations, you need a flywheel that has a lot of mass. Now, guys in F1, they don't like heavy stuff, don't tell your mom. So say you don't want to make it heavier, well, how about you increase the diameter of it? You put the mass further away from the center of rotation. Well, now you have a large object that you need to try to fit into your F1 car. That's kind of tough to do. There's not a lot of space you can work with. Because F1 parts need to be light and compact, the dampers of choice are not inerters. They're the energy dissipating shock absorbers that use gas and oil to turn oscillations of the springs, technically torsion bars in F1, into heat. But F1 is all about squeezing every last bit of performance out of the technology available. And even though the inerter couldn't be used in conjunction with the stiff torsion bars for the primary suspension, there was a smaller spring-like component whose oscillation needed to be dealt with: the tires. Undamped tire oscillations have a huge impact on mechanical grip, and the only way to prevent the tire's oscillations from upsetting the grip and balance of the car is to use a mechanical device like a J-damper. Ordinary suspension components like shock absorbers struggle to combat such small vibrations. Small movements of a shock's piston, it can't build the pressure needed to generate heat and dissipate energy. And shocks compress and extend relatively slowly compared to an inerter. But even small, low amplitude or rapid oscillations will rotate an inerter's flywheel, putting energy into it that can be fed back to damp that oscillation. When used in combination with springs and traditional shock absorbers, inerters provide a high level of dampening control over specific oscillations, and that's why nearly every F1 team uses them. So why are J-dampers being banned for 2022? Well, it's Formula One, where the answer is often the same: money.
It's a bunch of wankos.
Mercedes has won the Constructors' Championship for 7 years in a row, and they spend more money than any other team, reportedly as much as 4 times what Williams spends. To combat that inequality and make a more interesting series, the FIA is instituting a spending cap. To do that, they have to mandate that cars get simpler. certain parts are being eliminated, and the inerter is one of them. As part of that simplification, the FIA also wants the technology of F1 cars to be more like road cars. And they say things like inerters simply have no relevance to ordinary cars. But it's not all bad news, because the primary role of inerters is to damp oscillations specifically from the tires, and those occur predominantly in the tire sidewalls. Well, beginning in 2022, F1 will be moving from a 13-inch wheel to an 18-inch wheel, meaning tire sidewalls will be much shorter and stiffer and less prone to oscillations. With that difference, the once game-changing inerter may not be necessary after all. And if you really want to find out for yourself what all this inerter stuff is about, Cambridge University and Malcolm Smith, the inventor of the inerter, has licensed the technology to Penske, who will happily sell you one of these bad boys for a low price of $18,000. The B2B motto: cool things cost money, but you don't need money to be a cool thing. Put that on a t-shirt and send it to your mom. Thank you guys so much for watching this episode of B2B. Follow us here at Donut on Instagram at Donut Media. Follow me at Jeremiah Burton. Till next week, bye for now.